Looking at Rahab this morning, but before we get to the book of Joshua, I wanted to take a side trip to the Wild West. And if you have watched any movies like Tombstone or others like that, you know the typical scene, staring down the dirt center street of town, tumbleweed kind of rolls across town, and clapboard buildings with false fronts, and the saloon in the center of town, maybe, a deputy or somebody hanging out around those parts. And two strangers come riding into town. Now, the town is kind of controlled by a posse at the time. No real sense of overarching law in the area, though there is a sheriff. And the only real noise you can hear throughout the town is actually coming from the saloon. It's sort of the hub of the community, for better or for worse. And the lights and the sounds and everything going on, even the people are just kind of come spilling out of the swinging doors there. Swinging doors, I discovered this week that their proper title is Batwing. I did not know that, so there's your tidbit. But if you were to enter that saloon, of course, you'd find the proprietor behind the bar and barmaids, all dolled up in their gaudy attire to announce that their services are available for more than just waiting on tables, if you catch my meaning, as they often were in the Wild West. And so the two men take a room for the night, it being the only place to stay in town, the only thing close to a hotel. But of course, they've been watched, not just by one of the sheriff's deputies, but by the boss man's man, a member of the local posse. They knew that a new posse is trying to move into their territory and take over their illicit commercial activity, and so they've been on the lookout. And so when they lay down for the night, the man who's been watching the saloon, because naturally any stranger in the area would come there, goes to the boss and tells him what's happening. Well, they round up their gang and they head back to the saloon and wander into the main room of the saloon, to the bar, and start shouting, asking where these guys are, and head upstairs and kick in the door. But the room's empty. The window's open. And so a quick search ensues. They head back downstairs, but the bartender, he doesn't know anything about it. He sold them 2 rooms, and that was the last he saw of them. And so they run out back, check around. Their horses are gone, apparently. And so they ask the stable boy. The stable boy says, well, they took off out of town, actually, just a half hour after they got into their room. And so the posse heads out of town hot on their trail. But secretly, the 2 strangers have given the stable boy a few extra dollars, hidden their horses, and hidden the men in a couple barrels out back. And so once the posse rides out of town, they head the other direction and get off scot-free. But one day, eventually, not too distant, there's going to be a showdown. Now, I tell you that story because actually I think it has a lot of parallels to the story of Rahab. And some of the features of that I think are maybe a little easier for us to grab onto than if we were to kind of translate it directly into present-day Bonaccord. But that description of sort of the Wild West is probably not too far from actual events of the days of Rahab. And so we're going to be in Joshua chapter 2. This morning, looking at this character named Rahab. And we want to kind of understand a few things about her. We want to understand what was her situation like, what were the circumstances of her life. Second, we're going to find out what kind of person she is and look a little below the surface that way. Third, we'll look at what did she actually believe? Why is she notable in the Bible and in the history of faith? And then what was her reward, finally. But first, what was her situation? Well, we get that actually just right off the bat in Joshua chapter 2, verse 1. It says, Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. "Go, look over the land," he said, "especially Jericho." So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. So that we're picking up the story. We've jumped quite a bit from Hagar, obviously, but we're picking up the story. This is the people of Israel returning from slavery in Egypt, and they're coming into the Promised Land. And they're not quite in the Promised Land yet. They're on the far side of the Jordan River, and they're sending 2 spies out to scout out the land. And they're kind of hoping it goes a lot better than the last time they sent spies into the Promised Land, because that ended in 40 years wandering in the desert. So they send 2 spies in, and Joshua says, "Go look over the land, but especially Jericho." Jericho is situated just across the other side of the Jordan, and it's really going to be the first place that of major resistance that the people of Israel will have to conquer. And they can't. Jericho is notable because it's probably one of the oldest cities in the entire world, actually. In terms of being continuously inhabited. There's probably older ones that are ruins now, but the oldest city that's been continuously inhabited. And in Joshua's day, they had formidable defenses. And the problem for Israel was that they could cross the Jordan, and they probably had enough people that they can encircle the entire city, lay siege to it, cut it off, and eventually conquer it. But in the meantime, while that happened over the course of probably a few years, all the other nations in Canaan would gather up and could attack them during that time. So they needed to find a way to conquer Jericho quickly. And so the spies are sent out. So verse 1 ends, it says, "So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there." So we find out that Rahab is a prostitute. One of the reasons why I told that Old West story is because I think that's a similar sort of social construct in the Old West where, the saloon was the gathering place. It was also the hotel. It was also the place where the women of the night worked. Like, it was kind of all of that. And in Joshua's day, in the land of Canaan, it would have been similar, actually. And in fact, the word there used for prostitute can also mean innkeeper in certain situations, and they can kind of be used synonymously. And so you think of the Wild West, where it's like the saloon, you could say it was a saloon keeper, but you'd also understand that, there was a hotel in the same place. It was kind of the same thing we find out for Rahab. She's probably running a hotel of some kind, and in fact, we don't even know that she was probably a prostitute at some point, but she may not actually even currently be. But that's, certainly in the social atmosphere of that day, that's a label that would stick with you for most of your life. So, but she's referred to as the prostitute several times throughout the text, and so it seems fairly safe to assume that. But then we're told later on, that she's also got a mother and a father and siblings living with her. Which is notable in that it never names that she has a husband or any children of her own. So she's likely a single woman, and if she's caring for her extended family, it kind of points out that they're either much younger than her or that there's something else going on there. It wouldn't traditionally, in a traditional society like that, normally fall on a female member of the family to provide for the family in that situation. So there's something else going on in her situation. Maybe she's widowed. Maybe she's taking care of family that can't take care of themselves. But she's found really one of the few options for her in that day to provide an income and take care of her family. And so it's a little more than just just her solitary story of trying to look out for number one. She's looking out for her family in a real way. And so that's kind of Rahab's situation. Let's look at what kind of person she is now as the action continues. We're going to read on to probably the end of verse 11, I guess, maybe 13. We'll see how far we get. The king of Jericho was told, "Look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. There's some strangers that have rolled into town." So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab: Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. She said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up with them." But she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax she laid out on the roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan, and as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. So what kind of person was she? Well, first off, she was a person capable of lying, telling a lie in a tight situation. She was also, being a prostitute, probably existed a bit on the edge of society. Prostitution is a sort of a trade that has kind of existed in the same space for hundreds or thousands of years, in that, especially in a male-dominated society, it's, for women in that trade, the men are often glad to use the services, and yet also don't really want that. They frown on the presence of that person as well. And so there's this ambivalence, this apathy toward this lady that kind of lives on the edge of her society. And one of I think that's an important detail, because the question becomes, what loyalty does she owe her king? The king in that day would be the king of the city. We would probably see them more as like a overpowered mayor or something. But what loyalty does she owe to this person? And why does she stick out then as a person of faith as well, a woman of faith in the Old Testament? Well, I think that posing it that way in terms of what loyalty does she owe him? Does she owe him the truth? Is a helpful way for me to wrap my mind around why we're going to find out in the book of Hebrews, actually, she's commended for lying and hiding the spies. It would be one thing if it was just recorded, but the author of Hebrews actually points it out as, this was a good thing. She did the right thing in this situation. And so how do we wrap our minds around that? One of the, I think, most helpful writings I've ever read on that was actually by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, German pastor during the Second World War, highly involved in the resistance movement against Hitler. And in his book on ethics, he just kind of makes the point. He says, there are situations where you don't have a moral obligation to somebody just because they're in authority over you. If you have a Hitler in power and he's killing your countrymen and killing Jews, then you have a responsibility actually to work against that person. And you can lie to those officials because you do not owe them the truth. He puts it this way. He says he imagines like a school room and a child who's obviously has a hard home life and is being picked on even by his teacher all through the year. And he comes to school in the middle of the year with a black eye. And the teacher, very callously, very uncaringly is trying to wheedle out of him what happened, because he wants to make trouble for this family too. And Bonhoeffer's point is that child, that student, has no obligation to tell the truth to the teacher, because he knows the teacher does not care about him. He wields his authority for his own purpose and not for the good of those underneath him. And so in that way, Bonhoeffer kind of reasons there's an appropriate time to withhold the truth from somebody. And I think for me that kind of helps me wrap around, okay, why is Rahab here held up as a paragon of faith, even in the middle of lying to her king? Well, she probably doesn't owe him the truth. Another example, actually, that is often referred to in this instance is the midwives of Exodus chapter 1. When the people are told, when the midwives are told to kill all the Hebrew babies, they say, "Yeah, we'll do that," and then they turn around and don't. And that's an obvious lie, but it's because they don't owe the truth to Pharaoh. They don't. If somebody's telling you to murder babies, you can get away with lying. That's allowed in that situation, and in fact encouraged. But in situations for most of us where it's our parents or somebody who cares about us, we owe that person the truth. but Rahab is commended for hiding the spies at this point. And in fact, actually, if we go to Proverbs, chapter 31, verse 13, it actually talks about the virtuous wife or virtuous woman at the end of that chapter. And one of her activities, actually, that she's talked about as a virtuous woman is being hardworking, providing for her family, and it talks specifically, actually, about creating cloth and clothing, either to sell or to make for her family. And so it's interesting to me that actually the spies are hidden underneath a pile of flax that's drying on the roof. Because flax it's not a food crop, it's actually for clothing, to make linen. And so in some way, Rahab or somebody in her house is engaged in that activity. And so there's a sense that it's not that she's just trying to make her living on her back, that she's actually a very industrious person, providing for her family in many ways. But I think we get a rich portrait of her actually as we carry on and actually listen to what she has to say. Verse 8 picks up the story. It says, "Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, 'I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came up out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below.'" Now just listen to verse 13. Listen to what she's looking for and what she's done. "Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and my mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death." She's a kind woman, I think. Beneath it all, beneath whatever her occupational hazards were, she's a kind woman. She says, "I have shown kindness to you. Please show kindness to me." There are some strangers in town, and everybody's lit up with fear and wanting to turn them around and send them away. And Rahab, for whatever reason, responds differently than all her neighbors. She shows them kindness. And that would have been actually even a laudable act in her own culture. Cultures of the Middle East, hospitality under any circumstance was considered virtuous in many cultures there. And yet none of her neighbors did that. It was only for her. I think some of it is that because she exists on the edges of society, she sees things differently. She has a different take on a lot of things that are happening in her neighborhood. And she, frankly, probably doesn't have a lot to lose in terms of social standing. She is willing to take a risk in showing a powerfully surprising kindness to two strangers. But I think it's also a powerful statement as well. To say, "I've shown you kindness, please show kindness to me." To me, it speaks to what she really believes. We listen to her words. As I've said already a few times in this series, women of the Bible aren't often given the mic a lot of the time, and so we should pay attention when they are. In verse 11, she says, "When we heard of it, we heard the reputation of these Israelites coming to their land. Our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below." Now that might be kind of a bland statement for us in Scripture, but to hear it from the voice of somebody who's not an Israelite, who doesn't worship Jehovah God, it's actually an incredible statement. She's expressing her dissatisfaction with her own belief system that she would have grown up with in Canaan, where deities were seen as local, having sway over certain parts of Canaan, or whether it was up in the hills or down in the valleys. She probably had a local god for the area of Jericho. And instead she says, no, actually, your God, these foreigners, strangers for 420 years in our land, your God is actually God over all of the heavens and over all of the earth. And so she's saying something actually quite profound and saying it in faith. But of course, her faith leads into action as well. That's something that James will commend her for in James chapter 2, verse 25. He's arguing the point that, faith without deeds is dead. He says, there's something has to go along with it. It can't just be some sort of, idea floating around in your head, purely intellectual assent. You have to act on it as well. And so James points to Rahab, actually, of all people, and says she acted on what she believed. Well, listen, let's hear the rest of the story then. The men, the two spies, agree to showing her kindness since she has been kind to them. Verse 14, our lives for your lives, the men assured her. If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. I think that's an important admonition there, that they will treat her faithfully, that there's a kind of agreement or covenant between them. So she let them down by a rope through the window, a handy escape from a walled city. Paul will try that later too, with the aid of a basket as well. But it says, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. So there's kind of two building styles that would have been popular in that day. You'd either have two city walls built fairly close together, but sort of the outer one would be the main defense, and then there'd be sort of an inner ring, and people would still live between that. It was valuable real estate still because it was fairly protected. But another one was actually just to build an outer fortification and actually just build a house right onto that. And it wasn't odd to actually have a window looking right out the city wall. We're not quite sure which one Jericho was, but both would afford an opportunity for Rahab to actually have a back window or a back door that just emptied out outside. Probably just the window. So she lets them down through the window. And she said to them, go to the hills, so the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, and then go on your way. Now the men had said to her, this oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless we enter the land. When we enter the land, you have tied the scarlet cord in the window through which you have let us down. And unless you have brought your father and mother, your brothers, and all your family into your house, if any of them go outside your house into the street, their blood will be on your own heads. We will not be responsible. As for those who are in the house with you, their blood will be on our head if a hand is laid on them. But if you tell what we are doing, we will be released from the oath you made us swear. Agreed, she replied. Let it be as you say. So she sent them away, and they departed. And she tied the scarlet cord in the window. So they go on their merry way. But I think the details of her story are significant, certainly to the author of Joshua, likely Joshua himself. And he takes special interest to point out that, she let these spies down out of the window, but it was by a scarlet cord. And the color is important there, that dash of red around her house. And they say you have to keep that there to protect your home. Anybody inside your home, if that scarlet cord is up, is safe. And I think that is done in obvious reference, of course, to the same passage that the Israelites would go through in the Passover. A few books earlier in our Bibles, where the Israelites had to smear the blood of the lamb over their doorposts so that they could be saved when the angel of death came. Well, now we've substituted the angel of death for the armies of Israel, but there's still somebody that needs to be saved inside of the house. And they have to be inside. They're very specific about that. And so there's an obvious parallel there that Rahab's family is going to be rescued, is going to be saved, much in the same manner that the Israelites are going to be. In a sense, she and her family is being included in the nation of Israel by this act of salvation. They're being sort of brought into the fold through this common experience. Of course, as New Testament Christians, we look back at the the Exodus, and we see it really as a prefiguring of what Jesus has done for us. He's covered us in his blood and saved us through it. He's taken us out of the waters of our own sin and shame and brought us into his family, made us sons and daughters of our common Father. Did Rahab know all of that? I don't think she had that gift of prophecy necessarily, but she knew she was being included in something bigger when she was joining the nation of Israel. And through faith and acting on that faith, she was included. And Jesus, I think, has a blessing even for her. In John's Gospel, chapter 20, verse 29, it says, "Then Jesus told Thomas, who believes because he sees Jesus, he says, 'Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed.'" Blessed is Rahab, who didn't really even know a lot of maybe really profound theology, but she knew that God was the Lord of heaven and earth. And in that way receives the blessing of Jesus Christ. In that way, we receive the same blessing. We don't understand it all. You know, my theology is probably just as much a prototype as Rahab's. I don't get it all, and yet the question is more, will we grasp what we can understand? You know, Rahab understood that okay, this God is doing wonderful things through these people. I see who the true God is in my life, in all of creation. And so she grasped that. How did she grasp it? By an act of kindness, a simple act of hospitality, aiding and abetting two spies coming into her land. But I think it's helpful for me. You know, it kind of hits home. What can I do? I probably don't understand it all, but can I act on what I do understand? Can I show simple acts of kindness, you know, to maybe a lonely kid this summer? You know, it's easy to look around Bonaccord and find one or two that are, you know, don't get to take big holidays this summer, and maybe I can just spend some time with them, make some friends with a lonesome kid, or just send an encouraging note to somebody that, you know, despite, you know, all the restrictions lifting, maybe they're still stuck at home for whatever reason, their own health or other circumstances. I think these little acts of kindness, you know, often are very meaningful for people. They can be a powerful surprise, but I think it's also a powerful statement that we're thinking of people. We're thinking of others. We're loving our neighbors. And that is certainly its own reward, but even for Rahab, she had a reward for her faith. And so I want to flip over to Joshua chapter 6 just to make sure we get the rest of the story, that it wasn't just the aiding and abetting of spies, but that there was as it were, a happy ending. Joshua 6, chapter 22, or verse 22 says, "Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, 'Go into the prostitute's house and bring her out, all who belong to her, in accordance with your oath to her.' So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and her mother, her brothers and sisters, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it. But they put the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day." So the author who wrote this is saying she's still here. She's still among us. In fact, she's one of us now. And so her reward is belonging to her faith. That she's not a second-class citizen in the nation of Israel. She belongs. And to further confer that, you know, if we flip over to the book of Matthew chapter 1, we read in the genealogy of Jesus Christ that she, in fact, is actually part of his heritage, part of his ancestry. That the foundational, or sort of the true heirs of the kingdom of Israel are born from Rahab's line. And so there's this sort of stamp of approval to say, yeah, she's one of us. She's the real deal. And I think in a large part that was her reward, is that she had existed in Canaanite society on the fringe, away from the places of authority and power. She was not really accepted into proper social life, but through faith and through her act of faith, she's brought into the fold of Israel and called righteous, really. And so I appreciate that. I had tried to go back then to a picture of that in the Wild West, but I don't think they ever really got there in a lot of ways. There was a lot of enterprising women in the Wild West that made their way through lawlessness, but there weren't, it wasn't a happy society where women were offered sort of the reins in civic leadership and sort of, acting out their faith. They were still, especially in, the western frontier of America and Canada, is still kind of just given their role in society, and it took a while for that mold to be broken. One outlier I did find was actually the first minister of corrections and charity was the job title in Oklahoma. She actually became the first woman elected to a ministry role in the state or territory of Oklahoma, actually preceding her ability to vote by about 20 years, actually. And so she was actually occupied for 2 terms, a government role, before women could even vote for her. But she was just known for her charitable work and was given authority in that respect. And she actually really bettered the situation in Oklahoma in that she helped build some of the first prisons. So it wasn't, which to us doesn't sound like a good news story, but if the alternative is just a lynching or a hanging, then a prison might be okay, actually. And she actually the reason she only did 2 terms is in her second term, she actually began to advocate a lot for, in her day, they would have called them Indian rights, I guess, First Nations rights. We would more PC these days, but that raised the ire of the governor of her day, and so she actually they didn't kick her out of office, they just defunded her department to the point where it no longer existed anymore. So maybe not a great news story, but it was like she was able to contravene. She was elected, I think, in good faith, and because she was doing good work in the Wild West, as it were. And maybe we need a little bit of that just to say, yeah, we're going to be kind, even in situations where social convention maybe doesn't allow us to. And I think that's our call as Christians is to act on our faith and show kindness and love to all, to our neighbors, even, and it says, Christ even tells us to love our enemies, as it were. But how does that strike you this morning? Are there parts of Rahab's story that still raise questions for you? Maybe sit a little unevenly, a little uncomfortably. Let's discuss that a little bit. What about her story strikes you as problematic or exciting?